Welcome to our webinar on testing for ransomware exposure. I'm Taz Daughtry, the president of the Association for Testing and Software Quality Assurance. I'm delighted to take this opportunity to share some of my own insights about some recent newsworthy events. Unfortunately, ransomware, which has been known in cybersecurity circles for some time, burst upon the public awareness a couple of weeks ago due to a particularly prominent attack on a system of our infrastructure that most people had taken for granted. I mean, it is the case that typically there's so much in our daily lives that happens behind the scenes that we don't really know or appreciate it and understand the details of it until it stops working normally. And so I'm sure almost all of us were ignorant of the Colonial Pipeline company and the way in which the refined petrochemical products from the refineries in Texas were transmitted across many states up into the Northeast, and that those pipe systems are the basis all along the way for gasoline and other petroleum products to be delivered. And when in fact, that system was shut down because of this attack, this ransomware. It resulted in very visible consumer effects to the point that in a number of states, many gas stations were out of gasoline for days, and those that had them often had spikes in the pricing. And so we learn about this system, this infrastructure that happens normally behind the scenes because it was attacked. Ransomware being simply software that's used to extract or demand a ransom. So in this case, basically, important information is kept away from the user, typically by taking and encrypting it or putting it into a special coded form that can't be used until the ransom is paid and it is then decrypted or turned back into usable form. And so this is the actual ransom demand that was made on Colonial Pipeline Company. Now, one interesting thing is I was noticing this unfold in the last several days was that it looks like there were some compromises in one part of the system and that the actual effect was a deliberate decision made by the company to protect another part of their system. This really brings to bear the distinction between IT and OT. That is, information technology, which is the business side, was actually what was taken out of service. And at least at this point, the claim is that Colonial Pipeline Company decided that because they couldn't do the IT processing, specifically the billing to their customers, they shut down the OT, that is the actual operational technology that runs the system, that oversees the proper functioning of the system. There was early speculation that out of an abundance of precaution, as we say, an abundance of caution, the system was shut down because it was not known whether the compromise had happened across the entire system, the entire network. But again, most companies will keep their IT and their OT separate. And so in this case, the consumers, which saw the result from the OT shutdown, were actually suffering because of the corresponding IT that had been attacked and held for ransom. So all of that might be interesting and certainly was very visible to customers in the practicality of it. But we want to talk a little bit about how software testing fits into all of this and really how software testing contributes to all forms of cybersecurity and specifically securing against ransomware. How can you test to see if you're exposed to ransomware and how you will respond if a ransomware takes place? Ransomware attacks are being much, much more prominent now. I find one of the most useful ways to think about cybersecurity is using the NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology framework. Now, obviously, we discovered that the pipeline system is one of our critical infrastructures, and we need to protect and improve the cybersecurity of those infrastructures. And so one of the helpful things that the NIST framework does is give us 5 key functions on how we understand what we are protecting, how we are protecting it, and how we respond when those protections are not infallible. And so if I can step through each of those sections, will indicate how that might be useful in a cybersecurity realm, and specifically how testing can contribute to that. So the first step in the framework is to identify your assets. What are the things of value? How do you inventory those? And specifically, what is the best testing function to determine if those have been properly inventoried? The executive order from the president in the past few days includes a number of directives that the federal government is going to take, and that will obviously spill over into the civilian side, the non-government side, because of the buying power of the federal government. And one of the things that they're going to insist upon is, in software terms, but in hardware terms we would already know as a bill of materials. What is your inventory? What are the components that go into your system? As we know, for some other recent so-called supply chain attacks, one of the things we don't realize is how many of the products in our systems are from third-party vendors. Those, in fact, are even third and fourth tier vendors who are the subcontractors to the subcontractors to the contractors who eventually build up your product. And so there needs to be a way to understand not only what your product is, what it's made of, where it comes from, and confirm that you properly understand its value and how it fits together. So, for example, one of the asset inventory issues that would be important in the Colonial Pipeline situation was the extent to which the IT and the OT, the information technology and the operations technology, were separated, or the extent, at least functionally, that they depend on each other. That is, the operational technology could proceed, but from a business point of view, without the information technology keeping track of the product that was delivered and the pricing so that billing could be done to the customers, that the entire business was at risk. So even if it was only the IT that was under attack, the OT was affected, and that should have been part of this identification of assets. Now, the next thing that you will be doing in this framework is, once you know what the assets are and which ones are the most valuable to you and to potential adversaries, how are you going to protect them? And in terms of cybersecurity, the key aspect for that, I would say, is threat modeling. That is, because cybersecurity is defending against unknown threats, you have to project what those threats are going to be. Unlike software that just breaks on its own when we're talking about software reliability or performance evaluation, in the case of security evaluation, particularly cybersecurity testing, you need to test in a way that emulates the threats that are actually going to be attacking your system. That is, you have to have the same level of knowledge and skill, the same amount of resources that a motivated attacker would have. And so if you take part in an exercise, a so-called penetration testing from an outsider trying to break into your system, or particularly if you try to emulate an insider threat who's already aware of and inside your network, all of those are aspects that you need to do at the same level that the actual threat would be carried out. Otherwise, your testing doesn't prove anything. You can say, well, I tried to threaten the system, I tried to break into the system, I tried to escalate privilege throughout the system, move laterally the way an enemy might. But if you didn't do it with the resource, the skill, and the knowledge that the attacker is going to have, then you have not really given a good representation of how that attack would be defended. And so a negative result, that is an all clear from cybersecurity testing, that doesn't map to the actual threats that we are expecting, and it doesn't also modify as we learn more about those threats, is really not very useful. So that is all very important in deciding how you're going to bear risk and what you're going to do about how much you assign resources of various sorts to your defenses. But then again, the real issue is that none of those defenses are going to be perfect. And so whatever you do to defend, you have to work on the idea that some of those defenses will fail. and therefore you have to be prepared to detect intrusions that are actually taking place. And so that aspect is a key aspect that most people in testing would not think about. That is, in testing of any other feature than cybersecurity, you basically simply say, I'll see if the software breaks or fails to function properly under certain loads, and then I'll report that it failed or that it performed inadequately. And my test report will be the detection of that defect or the detection of that breakdown, of that imperfection. But in this case, we have to push it further because we have to actually say, well, even if we tell you there's a vulnerability, will you detect when some other adversary does try to break through? And so how good is your detection? So cybersecurity testing has to wrap around through all of the subsequent phases as well. Often most testing would not proceed beyond just filing a test report to say, oh, here's what happened. And that's the first and only time that the customer would know about it. In this case, we need to go through and see how well you will detect it. And specifically from a testing point of view, how promptly will that detection take place? The damage that's done is in the danger that the system will continue to be compromised for weeks to months to years. Those are the classic cases of what's been happening through the past. That we don't know that the system has been compromised, and so there's time for considerable damage to be done, literally tens to hundreds of millions of data sets to be removed, other ways in which the system will be damaged and that the vulnerabilities will be exploited. And not only does it need to respond and detect this promptly, but it has to have a specificity to say not only is there a defect that has been exploited successfully, but when and where, because we need to move to the next stage, which is responding. We need to know where the defect has been breached, where the defenses have failed, and therefore have enough information to know how to respond. And that's where, again, the testing doesn't stop at breaking into the system. The testing has to show that the user, the owner of the system, is aware of, detects that, and can properly respond. And so what we have to then is watch the way in which the incident handling process is exercised. In some of these classic cases in ransomware, I will admit the detection part is pretty obvious. Colonial Pipeline discovered that they had been breached when the ransom demand was made. So the detection was not the real issue here, but in this case, how they responded. Do they have a way of recovering to stop the problem from continuing and to get back into business? And so do they just sit around and negotiate to try to pay the ransom, which in this case apparently was paid, considerable amount of payment was paid, and then ironically enough, after a large multi-million-dollar payment supposedly was made, the decryption, the cleaning up of the data that had been encrypted by the intruder, that encryption was so slow and imperfect that they were not able to take advantage of, even after paying the ransom, to get that tool to get them back in business. They had to use other means, which really meant they really didn't have to pay the ransom in that case, because the ransom demand, when met, still did not satisfy the ability to recover. And so finally, what you have to do in cybersecurity testing is to test to see how thoroughly that restoration takes place. And obviously in a business case, time is of the essence. It was several days that the system was down, the pipeline was not pushing products. Then once it became fully operational at the time of recording this webinar, it's still the case that a majority of gas stations in several of the eastern coast states are still closed because they're out of gasoline. So the delay time of recovering back to full operational usefulness is in many days to weeks in this particular case. And so that's the kind of information that has to be provided to the customer, to the client for whom you're doing cybersecurity testing, because they need to aware, in this case, they need to put all this picture together and do the kind of risk analysis that would tell them, did I spend the proper amount of time in my defenses? Did I defend the right things in the right way? Did I do risk avoidance by making it less likely that the defects will be found and exploited? Did I also do the risk mitigation, which is in the detection, response, and recover side of things, which is the way in which you, even when the bad thing happens, you make sure it's not as bad as it might be. Can you recover more quickly? Can you have less damage done as a result of this particular compromise? And then beyond that, do you want to share the risk? One of the concerns with ransomware is that some of the cybersecurity insurance policies that are written will reimburse some amount, up to a large amount, some cases, the ransom that's actually paid. In fact, some of the insurance policies even include the fee to engage a ransom negotiating service to bargain down the ransom amount, which typically is unrealistically large. And then ultimately, if you decide to pay, which again, the advice is not to pay, as shown here, you don't have to pay as much. And are we somewhat cushioned by sharing that risk? Does that encourage the ransom to be paid? That's going to be an open issue. It's going to be a very interesting issue as we go forward. But cybersecurity testing at all 5 of these stages can contribute in a better understanding and more knowledgeable risk management. Now, before I finish, I do need to talk about the way in which the Association for Testing and Software Quality Assurance can help you individually and organizationally to come to grips with some of the knowledge and skills that you will need to do the cybersecurity testing, which would be helpful, again, in measuring, observing the degree to which you are exposed to ransomware or other types of activities. One of the things that is provided at SQA is an overview of testing essentials. It has a body of knowledge across 8 broad areas, and individuals can study and have resources to prepare for and then take a certification exam in that area that recognizes at this overview level the whole broad range of modern testing technology. Interestingly, I'll point out here that 2 of those 8 categories are in the intersection of what we were just talking about. There is, in fact, a module on cybersecurity testing, and there's a module on connected devices, the testing of things like the Internet of Things, cyber physical systems such as the pipeline. And these are, in fact, 2 areas that, apart from taking the full essential certification, are available for micro-credentials. So smaller chunks of material that you can study, that you can prepare for, that you can pass a small short exam to get a micro-credential in these areas. And we will continue to be providing a number of micro-credentials, perhaps even at the specific intersection of cybersecurity of Internet of Things, as a ongoing way of trying to keep you informed about the emerging technology and your contribution you can make as a tester. Now, there is another full-up certification specifically in connected devices testing, which would include an Internet of Things component to it. Just to finish up, one of the issues that would be important in understanding the detection and response portion of cybersecurity would be the attribution issue. And so in this particular case, as with many other cases, it's not always obvious who did this particular activity, who was responsible. But in this particular case, that has been pinned down, and it has obviously become an international issue, because even though in this instance it doesn't appear that the perpetrators were actual agents of the Russian government, they have a safe haven that's provided by the Russian government. And so at the international level, that's led to the engagement of some pretty serious discussions between heads of state. That also allows me to finish by indicating that one of my pieces of humor that has evolved from the dog ate my homework, as indicated a couple of years ago, to saying the Russians hacked my homework. I've decided we better update and indicate that the next excuse might be the Russians hacked my dad's gas tank in the car. So that is obviously an ongoing concern. It's not really a laughing matter by any means. Certainly people that were concerned about having the gasoline, and if the attack had been on a different pipeline, could have actually brought the electrical grid down, because a lot of the electricity generated in the eastern part of the country comes from natural gas, which was not in this particular pipeline, but it's also a vulnerable area. So we're going to have more and more concern about attacks that might take place on our critical infrastructure. So it's a pleasure today to share with you some of these personal insights about testing for ransomware exposure. I have my email address there if someone would like to follow up, and I also have a Twitter feed that included one of the posts that I showed you earlier. So I hope that will be helpful, and if we can continue to engage in further discussion, are there resources that the Association for Testing and Software Quality Assurance can make available to you, please take advantage of that. Please let me know if you have any other questions or need some help. Thank you today.